I'm going to tell you about the worst week of my life. I was in my early 40s and at the pinnacle of my career, or at least what I thought was the pinnacle of my career. I was an associate pastor of a church of nearly 3,000 adults. I preached 30 to 40% of the time. I oversaw most of the major areas of the church organization and served on the senior leadership board. I fully expected to assume the powerful role of celebrity pastor. Alongside my wife of 20 years and my 3 young daughters, we were living the idyllic life. I was still young, but by the standards I had set for myself, I was successful. I was having an impact. I was a powerful man until the day I got fired. My house was nearly 30 minutes from the church office, but to this day, I have no memory of the drive home after I was fired. The only thing I can remember was the startled look on my wife's face when I walked in the door just before noon. I told her what had just happened, and she, like me, just stood there in shock. I sat on the couch, and the tears came, heaving, sobbing tears of sadness and loss. And then after the tears came a kind of rage that makes a man want to break things, throw things, hit things. But the tears had taken their toll on me, and I had no strength. I was spent. Thankfully, my kids were at school, so they didn't have to see me like that. Eventually, I walked outside to my driveway, and I prayed one of the most honest prayers I've ever prayed. I said, God, if this is ministry, to hell with this shit. Amen. I remembered back to the last staff member who was let go from this church. He had been seen coming out of a strip club, and rumors about him were rampant. And I didn't want that for me or my family. So the last thing I asked was that the church make a public statement about my firing to avoid any speculation. But in a final blow, they denied my request. They said, you're overreacting. After that, they bought my silence with a severance agreement that also functioned as a gag order, and I felt compelled to sign it. I had a mortgage and a young family depending on me, so I had no choice. And soon enough after that, the rumors started. People thought I got fired because I had had an affair. So there I was, blindsided, stripped of my income and ripped from my community. One day I belonged to something I thought was full of meaning and purpose, and the next day I was an unemployed pastor, socially exiled from nearly every relationship, every point of human connection, and every place of belonging. All of my ambition, my competence, my sense of identity as a man, all of my power, all of it was gone. And in its place was a tearful pile of emasculated humiliation. But at least I still had my health. What remained intact was my identity as a physically strong and healthy man. I'd been an all-star college football player and had stayed in great shape, but still the waves of tears and rage became a more or less daily occurrence during the next season of my life. But the solitude that I found from running in the mountains was really my only reprieve, and I did that a lot. Until the day I tore a tendon deep in my right hip. I didn't know it then, but the injury would be the beginning of a 10-year odyssey of chronic, debilitating pain as both hips deteriorated past the point of repair. What I thought was the worst week of my life snowballed into the worst decade of my life. Before I turned 50, I had had both hips replaced with very invasive and painful surgeries. Before and after the surgeries, I struggled some days even to walk. I could barely climb a flight of stairs or bend over and tie my shoes. I remember shuffling around the grocery store, leaning heavily on the shopping cart, like a man in his 90s, not a man in his 40s. And in order to cope with the pain, I consumed inappropriate amounts of just about any prescription pain medication you can think of. Think back on that time, mostly I was trying to just get through each day without a complete meltdown. My sense of identity as a man had been shattered. I was still a man, but from my perspective then, I was a weak man. Like most of my peers, I inherited a masculine mythology that taught me that men were supposed to be leaders of the home and providers of the family, strong men. I provided very little for my family during this season, though. And while my wife had always worked, most of it was part-time to allow her the freedom and flexibility to provide care for our kids and to augment my income. But now, with me in my early 40s, unemployed and barely able to walk, she became the sole breadwinner. She led me and our family with love and wisdom through this season, and we're better for it. I'm better for it. I know that now, but then it was a different story. The end of this long season of what feels like masculine exile was ironic in profound, life-changing, and humorous ways that I'm only now beginning to understand. You see, in between my first and second hip replacements, I'd begun to hear more and more about this thing called sex trafficking. So I began to research the issue and attend any event or meeting I could get into that would help me more fully understand the issue. What was immediately apparent was that men created the problem of sexual exploitation, of sex trafficking, and the problem wouldn't be solved unless better men somehow showed up to help. That much was clear, but what wasn't so clear was what exactly we should do. And looking back, I'm beginning to realize that while my motives to get involved were valid, they weren't exactly pure. Yeah, it's true that I wanted to help stop the exploitation of vulnerable people, which is a good and just reason for getting involved. But I've realized that by doing so, I was also trying to resurrect my shattered sense of masculinity. Eventually, though, this testosterone-fueled hubris that I was experiencing also began to be questioned by the very people I was trying to help. There's probably a more honest way to tell this part of the story, though. I'd begun to meet with and work with women who were trafficked as children and were now adult activists, and they began to call out my duplicity, and ironically begun to lead me on a journey that would help me not recover a lost sense of masculinity by enabling me to act out some superhero fantasy, but through their suffering, their lived experience, their feminine wisdom, they gave me a fuller and richer vision of the kind of man I needed to become. A man who did not base his value on career success or athletic capabilities, but on characteristics like humility, empathy, meekness, and appetite for justice. And they stood by me with patience and way more grace than I deserved as I struggled to grow. The beautiful irony of the worst season of my life is that the women that I set out to rescue actually rescued me. They rescued me from a burdensome, deceptive, and damaging masculine paradigm that kept me broken and in pain for over a decade. They rescued me from the tyranny of poisonous masculinity that tricked me into believing that power, aggression, and control were the only things of value I had to bring to the world. The irony of my journey into the anti-trafficking movement was that the very women who suffered the most at the hands of powerful men were the ones who taught me that what I was really missing as a man was not power, but strength. And in 100 ways that still amaze me, they've been kind and wise enough to help me gain that strength. I work with a group of amazing volunteer men who, for 10 years now, have been actively disrupting tens of thousands of attempts to buy sex from exploited women and girls. And one of the most striking things about this whole experience is the realization that's shared by all our guys is that we're 3 or 4 bad decisions away from being just like the men we're talking to on the phone. Doing this kind of work forces a man to deal with the truth about himself. It forces us to face a kind of naked humility. I think humility is often misunderstood and, frankly, grossly undervalued in the man world. Humility is simply the ability to see yourself for who you truly are. The root word comes from earth and dirt. It's the practice of seeing our faults and celebrating the things that we're good at, our passions. And it's holding both of those aspects in tension. It's not about self-deprecation or letting people walk all over you, but about being aware and honest with who you truly are, good and bad. But being humble doesn't mean being weak. It means having the courage to acknowledge our strengths, but also being open to learning from others. It's about recognizing that no one has all the answers, and about embracing opportunities to grow and improve. I believe that being humble helps us build stronger connections. It makes us more approachable to the people around us. In a nutshell, what does humility mean? I've come to believe it means these things. It means a man who can look unflinchingly at his own brokenness and frailty and deal with it. Not deny, not deflect, not dismiss. And if he can do that, this kind of man then realizes that life is not about him, that the world doesn't exist for his benefit, but that somehow, even in ways that might terrify him, that man is here for the benefit of the world. That eventually, even though he feels woefully inadequate for the task, he leans into it anyway. That's what humility looks like. One in 3 women will face some form of sexual harassment or violence in their lifetime. I have 3 daughters, so I've done the math myself. Every day in our communities, women are minimized, trivialized, vilified, ignored, ridiculed, dismissed, objectified, commodified, abused, beaten, raped, tortured, and killed by a small number of men, while most other men do or say nothing. Jasmine was brought to me one day by a friend who was helping her escape from a pimp who was threatening to kill her. We had played a small role in a larger effort that included advocates, police, FBI, and a long-term treatment facility. And my friend brought Jasmine to me because she wanted me to pray for her before she got on a plane. She stood in my office, small, timid, and frail, with a bruise on her shoulder the exact size of my hand. I mumbled some lame prayer, what felt like anyway, and they left, and then I broke down. I had no words, only deep sadness, and I sobbed. Guys, we have to face the truth of this broken world, but we cannot mourn it if we're busy talking or trying to create solutions or rushing around in an ignorant panic trying to fix things or bust the bad guys. Maybe in the face of the deep pain and suffering women endure every day, maybe the best place for men to start is to simply shut up. Shut up and listen. Feel the weight of the brokenness to the degree that we can. I say this because I believe the brokenness must break us before we can begin building something better together. And empathy is that. Empathy is nothing more than to see others for who they truly are. Empathy is to focus on others, and by definition, begins by paying careful, compassionate attention to others. Then it produces thoughtful action. I got to tell you about my nephew, CJ. He is a 6'2" mountain of a young man. He's a professional football player, and he's the epitome of this thing that we call meekness. Doesn't mean that he's weak, doesn't mean that he avoids difficulty, it doesn't mean that he's nice, and it most certainly doesn't mean that he's weak in personality or character. The word meek speaks of and refers to something like the strength of a horse that becomes conditioned and controlled by the bit that's placed in his mouth. Think of a war horse or a plow horse or my nephew CJ. It's disciplined strength. I believe that men possess a unique kind of strength, but that strength is too often undisciplined, lacking in constructive purpose, and becomes abusive. But meekness is the kind of strength that provides that shoulder that's ready to lean into difficulty and struggle, especially on behalf of the vulnerable. Meek men give away their strength, they don't wield power. Meek men show deference to the vulnerable, especially women. Meek men serve before they speak. Meek men care very little for the results of so-called real men who use their power to perpetuate violence, inequality, and injustice. So what is meekness? One way to look at it is simply being a strong shoulder that can lean into hard things like sex trafficking, but it can also be leaned upon. Being meek doesn't mean being weak. It's about having strength under control and channeling our power for good. Meekness is the ability to stay calm in challenging situations, to respond with kindness instead of aggression. It's like a superpower that can allow us to resolve conflicts peacefully and build harmonious relationships. We talk a lot about having an appetite for justice. What does that mean? It means things like this. It means standing up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. It's about championing things like equality, fairness, and standing against discrimination. When we have an appetite for justice, we use our voices to speak out against that injustice and work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable world. And this is so much more than attending an event or watching a movie or reading a book or writing a check. Your appetite is something that you have to satisfy every single day. Lou Malnati's pizza is the standard against which all other pizza is measured. And growing up in my home near Chicago, Lou's for dinner meant that we had to order our day around that glorious slab of bread and cheese and sausage and sauce. Appetites order our world. They shape our agendas. They set our daily priorities. We pay attention to our appetites every day, hourly sometimes. Thoughts of food and drink are never far from our minds. But here's my point. Insatiable appetites for injustice, for power, for control, for violence are destroying our communities at every level. And we can't restore our communities without an equally strong appetite for the flourishing of every human being. And this is perhaps the greatest challenge for men, to order our lives around something bigger than ourselves, or our reputations, or our careers, our power, our position, and our privilege. It's the nature of toxicity to destroy the connections that create vibrant and healthy life. Those connections exist at the cellular level, but they also exist relationally. And the current dominant masculine narrative is toxic, it's poisonous, it's corrosive. And until that toxicity is addressed and challenged, the bonds of healthy community can't be sustained. Men and women remain estranged. So the way I see it, the challenge before us is nothing short of gender reconciliation. So let's be mindful of the threat of toxic masculinity, but let's also look beyond it towards a more generative, life-giving vision of what it means to be a man. A man marked by humility that shakes him to the core and then breaks his heart and then draws out of him the best kind of strength. Then it inflames this holy appetite to make the world a better place. When I was young and stupid and had all my original parts, I fancied myself a pretty good mountain biker. Until the day I was bombing down a mountain in Colorado and I spotted this big gnarly rock in the middle of the path. So with my gaze fixed squarely on the threat, the bike headed straight towards it. And the front wheel slammed into that rock and the bike pitched violently up and forwards. For a brief moment, as I was flying over the handlebars, I wondered if I could have done something different. And then it hit me. If I would have stayed focused on where I wanted to go and not on the obstacle in my way, I could have steered around it, but I didn't, so I crashed. There's a big gnarly rock right now in the path that leads to a world of healthy thriving for men. It's a view of manhood defined by violence, sex, status, and aggression, where strength or power is everything, while emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are yardsticks by which men are measured. The big gnarly rock is also known as this thing we call toxic masculinity. Epic is focused on engaging men to combat the demand that drives sex trafficking in America. I've seen firsthand what this mindset does if left unchecked, unchallenged. But here's the thing, the violence done to sex trafficking victims is not an isolated and unique form of crime. Sexual exploitation, misogyny, and other cultured norms that perpetuate men's power over women share the same poisonous root. This view of manliness has done more damage than I think can be calculated. But if all we do is stare at the obstacle that we're trying to avoid, it only draws us towards it, not towards where we want to go. So the question that I want to pose to men is, where do we want to go? Where do we want to go as men? What kind of men do we want to become? In a world of he said, she said, me too, and presidents and porn stars and movie moguls and pop culture icons turned predators, what if we considered a different masculine paradigm? Generative masculinity. What is generative masculinity? It's a term that we didn't invent, but we use a lot. It's about taking the time to rewrite the script and redefine what it means to be a man. This is an invitation to build a future where everyone thrives. Generative masculinity promotes positive qualities like empathy, emotional intelligence, respectful behavior. It's about being strong while embracing our emotions and respecting others. It's an invitation to challenge toxic beliefs and embrace generative masculinity to become better men. In relationships, it means prioritizing giving rather than taking. It's about equality, not competition. And this mindset creates a foundation for healthy growth and mutual thriving. I believe we can make a positive change through self-awareness, questioning harmful attitudes, and promoting these things like empathy and kindness. Start with humility. This is the courage to acknowledge our strengths and learn from others. It helps us build stronger connections and makes us more approachable. Empathy is almost like a superpower that allows us to understand and share in others' feelings and experiences. And we create a supportive and inclusive environment by listening without judgment, by being attentive, and by genuinely caring. Meekness is not weakness. It's disciplined strength. And a hunger for justice means standing up for what's right, championing things like equality, fairness, and fighting discrimination. Let's use our voices, let's use our influences to create a world like that. By embodying these strengths, these traits, we become catalysts for positive change. Our actions can inspire others, creating a ripple effect in our communities. Together we can reshape a future where justice and respect prevail. So let's redefine masculinity by showing strength through compassion, by standing up for what's right and using our strength to create a just and equal world. Epic Project is an organization fighting exploitation and human trafficking. We raise awareness, provide support, and empower communities to take action. Join us in creating a future where freedom and dignity are universal. Epic Project exists to do two things: disrupt the demand that drives sexual exploitation and dismantle the forces that perpetuate it. At Epic Project, we're dedicated to fighting against exploitation and human trafficking, and our extensive work aims to, among other things, raise awareness, provide support, and empower communities to take action. We can create a future where everyone can live with freedom and dignity and free of the fear of exploitation. Did you know that human trafficking affects millions of people worldwide? It's a real and pressing issue that demands our attention, but make no mistake, it is a business driven by supply and demand. Men buy sex, that is the source of the problem. If there were no buyers, there would be no business of exploitation. Now you might wonder, how can I make a difference? There's several ways that you can get involved. First of all, visit our website at epicproject.org to learn more about our work, more specifically about our work and the resources available and the partnerships that we have all over the country. Share our message on social media, raise awareness among your friends, have a conversation, and talk about how we need to support survivors through volunteering or even fundraising. Every action counts, no matter how small. By joining Epic Project, you become a part of the solution, creating a ripple effect of change that can transform lives. So let's stand together. Let's be a driving force for a better world by becoming better men. Together we can combat exploitation and empower survivors and create lasting change. Visit epicproject.org today and join the movement against human trafficking. Together, let's make a difference that will echo through generations. Together, let's become better men.